So I think to build that resilience in your business, you need to broaden your viewpoint on risk. I think each company needs to find their own way. There is no hard and fast, there's nothing written in stone. You have to figure out what is right for your company.
If you look at countries like the Maldives, they don't have a lot of structures and reporting and all of that, but climate risk is real for them. So if you build a hotel there and you completely ignore climate factors, the ROI is not so great.
And if we look at Sri Lanka's context, all of our exports are largely connected to and come from nature, from spices to coconut, rubber, tea. And Sri Lanka has the onus to not only be ESG compliant in this and to adhere to these regulations.
Hello, we are on Echelon's She Slays. Today we are discussing the topic of making the business case for ESG. Here with me in the studio is Prashani Illangasekera. She is the General Manager, Group ESG, Hayleys PLC. We have Pyumi Sumanasekara, Partner, KPMG. And we have Emma De Silva, Chief Executive of Good Life X. Welcome, everyone. So with that, let's dive deep into our conversation. Pyumi, to start off with, Pyumi, I would really like to pick your brain on one of the big questions that we have. What gets measured gets done. It's not easy in the ESG world, environment, social governance, environment. There's a lot of data points you talk about. Social is very qualitative. How do you measure those? So in the context of the corporate world, how easy, challenging is it to actually measure ESG?
Okay, so what gets measured definitely gets done. Absolutely. So let me address that first and then go into the measurement part because that can be a little bit more difficult. So if you look at what gets measured gets done, it's about when you see the number, then you realize, oh, there's actually an impact on my business. And generally decision makers really look at it from the perspective of bottom line or impact on business. If you don't put that number on the table and you don't have a look at it, never gets done, obviously, because it's very hypothetical. So I'll give you an example of a simple thing in the early days. And this wasn't even when ESG was as trendy as it is right now, in somebody else's words. It was energy cost and a large supermarket chain, how they realized that their freezers were too cold and they ended up saving throughout their cold chain millions and millions of dollars across the world, right? So those are easy things to measure. Yes, I agree, there are harder things to measure, but over time, I think things will get better as we start doing things. And on the more practical side of things, if we're afraid of doing it, which is where I see some companies and organizations are, we keep saying, oh, we don't know how to do that, it's too difficult. We're never going to get there. So we're never going to know, and we're going to probably lose competitive advantage from the others who do.
That's very interesting. And also ESG is pretty much a journey. You start small, but then you scale it up, you get better every day. So that's how companies who have actually excelled in ESG has done this. Prashani, I'd like to hear your thoughts working in a big organization such as Hayleys.
So, I completely agree with Pyumi's point, right? And as part of, so I represent Hayleys. We have over 180 companies across 14 verticals. So you can imagine how difficult the data part of it is. But in addition to measuring, I think it's also really important that this information reaches the right people. And, I cannot stress the importance of this enough, because you may have all the data points in the world just sitting on like a finance manager's desk or a sustainability head's desk. It makes no sense, right? And there is no point just looking at these numbers just to report it in the annual report, which unfortunately is what happens in a lot of companies. So, I'll give you an example. Like, we were looking at our HR numbers, right? And then there was this trend that at executive level, female representation is very high. But then when you go up the ladder, at like management level, it was only about 12%. And then we started looking at the numbers, and we found that 60% of our girls don't come back to work after having their first child, right? So there are a lot of social and cultural issues around this. But then, so we presented this to the ESG steering committee, which comprises of directors. And so at that point, they sat up and they listened and they were like, yes, now when there is so much turnover, you have to keep investing in recruiting people. You have to keep investing in training them right from the start. So now we need to figure out how to retain these girls. So this is how the conversation about paternity leave, there is now daycare allowance given. So, really impactful decisions can be made if the information goes to the right people. So I think that is something that, we really, really need to focus on. Yeah.
Okay. And when we speak about actually what measures gets done, it's very important that this is actually driven by the senior leadership of an organization, because we all know if it's not a top-down approach, it doesn't really get inculcated in the culture of an organization. Emma, if I move on to you, your insights or experience in terms of what gets measured gets done in the SME world and in the corporate world, if you can share some of your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad we're on the same page with this because we see the same in the work that we do at Good Life X, especially when working with corporates. And I think one important question that we want to ask for larger corporates is if your sustainability department, because often in times of crisis, that is the first to go. And it's not because it's not important or the work is not relevant, but it's because this perspective, this mindset, that it's not seen as a valuable metric to inform business decisions, business strategy. So if that department was to go, what does the sustainability, if we take sustainability, in your business look like? What does your ESG look like? How is it measured if that department is removed? And I think that's getting at seeing a lot of these practices as secondary or auxiliary, rather than seeing ESG as a core strategy, something that comes and is infiltrated across a business's operations rather than something that is secondary. And I think by making that integration, that's where we can get at, where you both discuss, can be a major tool for leaders to make great business decisions.
Brilliant. It's very interesting you brought up that there are specific ESG departments that become redundant when things get tough. But ESG shouldn't ideally be a department. It should be everyone's responsibility. It should be the boards need to be just like your financials. It's something that needs to be reviewed constantly because that's the only way it actually gets implemented. That brings me on to my next question in terms of ESG adoption in organizations. How have you seen this, Prashani? Has it been challenging or has it been welcomed by the leadership of the organization? What has that adoption looked like?
Okay, so I'll be honest here, and I completely agree with Pyumi that, it has to have a financial benefit for leadership to really look at it. And whether we like it or not, I think that is how the market is, and you can't blame them because at the end of the day, the purpose of a business should be shareholder value, or one purpose of a business, right? So I think I'll speak from my perspective at Hayleys. I think over the past couple of years, it has become strategically important. And this for us is driven by two things, right? So we are an export-oriented company. We have over 50% of revenue coming from exports. And now we've really seen the pressure coming from customers. So ESG, which used to be like a, nice thing to have, it would make you look good. Now it has evolved into something really strategic to the point where, you can't even do business without having certain fundamentals in place. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So we have Dip Products, which is one of the world's largest glove manufacturers, right? And we have clients who are now saying, I'm not interested in the carbon footprint of the company. I want to know the carbon footprint of this particular glove, right? So we have to do life cycle analysis of gloves. Same in activated carbon. So they want targets per metric ton of activated carbon, the particular product they are buying, right? So it's that detail. So this has really kind of compelled the leadership to now look at this and say, okay, now we need to start investing in this, right? And also, I think at Hayleys, we've really started seeing this as an opportunity. Whereas, there are certain countries that will not be able to meet this standard. So then, can we position ourselves to be in this niche, right? So customer pressure, number one. Number two, and I think Pyumi can elaborate on this more, is the regulations that are coming. Again, particularly from EU, which is very progressive on ESG. We are not still sure what's happening in the US, but EU for sure, right? So there's the EU deforestation regulation, which is hitting us. So again, DPL, the glove manufacturer, if you are exporting to EU, they have to be able to prove that the gloves we manufacture is not sourced from latex that was taken from a tree that was planted after deforestation, right? So these are really challenging things to do in Sri Lanka. So now we source rubber from like 5,000 smallholders. So how do you ensure that traceability across such an extensive value chain, right? So these kind of developments really require financial investments, right? And with these regulations coming in, it has driven really deeper integration of ESG. And also, I think, again, Pyumi can elaborate on this, is like the greenwashing regulations that are coming. You can't just say you're carbon neutral. You can't buy trees somewhere and say, okay, I'm carbon neutral. So you have to be able to prove it scientifically. So I think these are really, really good developments in the market. May not be readily accepted by certain parties who are not used to it. But I think for us, those in the ESG space, they're all very welcome developments.
Yeah, so you actually, what you were explained with your example is actually the CSRD regulations that are actually coming from EU, which is applicable to pretty much every single industry. And the worst part is ESG is seen as a cost in most organizations. Yes, there is an investment, but there is a return on it. It might be longer term, but right now companies still see it as a cost. Pyumi, what are your thoughts on that and in terms of adoption in general?
Okay, so if I say a jump on where Prashani left off and then link it to that. So if you say it's a cost, let me give you an example of a strategic decision a business made, and this is real. I will do a hypothetical example of it. Let's say we had a business that invested in a mango plantation post 2020, and it was deforested post 2020. Somebody funded them, right? And they have gone ahead and done this. Now they're going through a training with us and a conversation pre-engagement, and we talk about the EUDR. And where do you think this project is? It's not viable because their initial plan was to export to the EU or to a supply chain related to the EU. Cost of ESG, huh? So that cost goes across the corporate who's invested, the bank, whoever funded, and then we have management looking around going, oh, how did we miss this? Why? Because we didn't invest in horizon scanning, regulatory scanning, and we didn't realize the risk, whilst there is an opportunity, if they went about it the right way, right? So the cost of ESG can be justified by the opportunity or these very costly mistakes as well that can come. Again, I can see even family-owned businesses, SMEs, who are investing in, say, traceable black pepper farms, right? Because the price point is probably going to be a lot higher down the line. Coming from an international firm, we have actually tried, this was a few years ago when all of this happened, to try and, because EU was expanding supply chains into more sustainable markets, and obviously we've had these conversations, and we tried to sort of marry off our clients there here because obviously we're for Sri Lanka. However, we were not geared to take those conversations forward. I think now we'll probably be a little bit in a better footing. But these are the costs, whereas we had our aspect counterparts who had businesses who were ready for it. So expansion of supply chains.
Okay, so from what I hear from Pyumi and Prashani, the regulatory or the compliance aspect plays a huge role in ESG adoption in the organizations, which shouldn't be the case all the time. But if we leave the regulation part aside, there are scientific targets that we have to reach, things like the SBTIs, where we have to limit global warming to 1.5. I think we are way past that now. It's now the target is 2 degrees Celsius, at least, right? And it very specifically says you can't net off your carbon emissions by more than 10 to 15%. But organizations are really not doing it. They're setting off their carbon emissions because they haven't really pledged to adhere to those targets set by scientists, right? But Emma, if I move on to you in terms of all of this, I'd like to hear a different angle in terms of leaving aside the regulatory and compliance requirements. What are the other aspects that really drive ESG adoption?
Sure. I think when it comes to the work we've done with corporates, and that's something that we've done through our Thrive canvas, and this was introduced about 2 years ago, flipping the traditional business model canvas to help identify segments in the company's operations where they can become more regenerative and more inclusive. And so this is something that has stemmed from a place where we see in a lot of our work in the past 7 years being done with startups and SMEs in these nature-based sectors, where they have championed so much of these ESG policies without even largely realizing it. And so it comes to the adoption from their perspective, they're quite agile to amend and to fit into them. And while when we work with corporates, it's a bit of a challenge because, of course, there's so many barriers that they have to work through. And again, in these nature-based sectors, and if we look at Sri Lanka's context, all of our exports are largely connected to and come from nature, from spices to coconut, rubber, tea. And Sri Lanka has the onus to not only be ESG compliant in this and to adhere to these regulations, but to set a standard that we can move away from more extractive methods and really champion and pioneer what we really advocate for, which is more regenerative policies, giving back more than they take. I think one such example that we've seen is a company we work very closely with, Serendipity. They're the world's first and currently only regenerative organic coconut manufacturing company. And the regeneration doesn't stop in their farming. It's not just in their farming. It's actually in the work that they do with the communities, in the wages they pay, and the hours that the workers work, as well as in the intention that they have with the partnerships that they build. They're very cognizant of, does this partner do their values align to ours as a company, and who are their end consumers? So it's that very holistic approach that ESG is a great tool to help identify, but what we bring in with the Thrive Canvas is to go further and to really pinpoint the areas that, again, may already be things that are already being done, but how can we bring those out and really highlight those beyond just what is needed to be reported upon?
Guys, I would really like to hear from all of y'all, like a couple of examples of how ESG has actually made commercial sense. You know, if you can really pick an example and tell all of us how that's really elevated the business.
Yeah, sure. I think there's like many examples of that. And a few of those are what I mentioned earlier. Those are more the peripheral things that you just do cost elimination or you have access to markets in terms of opportunities. But going down the route of where Emma was directing us towards, definitely rebuilding, where you go back to the building blocks and re-look at the business. Like, for example, if you go down the logistics world, there's a huge opportunity even in Sri Lanka from an emissions perspective, where we have even maybe somewhat dilapidated but can be sort of revived railroad systems. And road to rail is like a no-brainer in terms of emission factor reduction. And that has happened in countries like the UK, and the emission factors are very low. Again, which opens up opportunities in the long run in terms of longevity, in terms of costs. A lot of these companies are seeing cost reductions as well. And it's also not just the EU markets, right? Like, I work with companies even from the US, irrespective of all of that, who we've had conversations who've said, hey, we're not touching X, Y, and Z, for example, coal. We're not going to go down that route. We're not going to fund it, right? So examples of business taking over the initiative, lobbying, working together, because in Sri Lanka, I think one company may not be able to, but an industry can, like Garments Without Guilt and what they did. It made sense as an industry, right? Long time ago. There's huge opportunity to stop competing on reporting, but come together strategically as industries to maybe take our product global, right?
Interesting.
Yeah, I think there's also the angle of effective risk management, Imali, right? So I think if you really have a strategic focus on ESG, and we have seen this, we have had this conversation so many times, is that you can build a more resilient business, right? And at the end of the day, I think that is the most important thing. So even if you look at the top 10 global risks in the world, right now, out of the top 10, there's 5 which are environmental risks, right? And these are risks which invariably translate to companies and directly hit their top line and their bottom lines, right? So I think this is something we can come to when we talk about like reporting and how it's kind of directing focus towards this risk angle. But definitely, I think there is a commercial value there. You are looking at risks beyond your traditional credit risk or liquidity risk or operational risk, which is like typically financial risks, right? And look at a broader, more holistic view of risks, because these are now hitting you from all sides. So there's like a really sharp shortage of coconut in the country. We've seen it, right?
Yeah.
And it's like hugely impacting some of the businesses we are in. And, then when you look at the research, you're like, this is actually climate change. It's other things as well, but it is also climate change. Same with rubber. Like, when we were in school, it was tea, rubber, coconut. Those were our main export crops, right?
Yeah.
This is what we learned when I was in school. I don't know why you're. But, now it's not. I mean, we have to import rubber now. So it's to that level. So I think to build that resilience in your business, you need to broaden your viewpoint on risk.
Can I just jump in?
Absolutely.
I think we've had this conversation many times as well. Like if you look at countries like the Maldives, they don't have a lot of structures and reporting and all of that. But climate risk is real for them.
It is.
So if you build a hotel there and you completely ignore climate factors, the ROI is like, not so great.
Yeah.
But they've sort of adapted to that over a period of time without putting the climate risk branding on it, because it's a necessity for them. And that's how I think this risk angle needs to come in, because otherwise we're like with blinders on.
Absolutely. I'm going to break ESG down a little bit, Emma. I know you were waiting to say something, but I'm going to break it down because I have a very specific thing that I would like to ask you. Yes, we spoke about governance where, it needs to be, the top has to be aligned. It needs to be driven down to the rest of the organization. Yes, environmental issues, very real. We see it all around us. But the social pillar, right? The minute there's no food on the table, everything else goes out the window, right? And we see so little, even companies that do extremely well on their ESG performance. If you really break down the pillars, you see that they score very low on the social aspect. Emma, I would really like to come to you in that sense. How do you see it, and what are the implications you've seen, especially in the SME sector?
Sure, definitely. And I think a good starting point is actually what Prashani was saying when it comes to resilience of a company, especially with SMEs, where they may be a little bit more one-track focused because of the nature and the size of the company. But I think one example of this that I'd like to share that kind of hits on a lot of points, not just environmental, but as you asked, socially. One company that we worked with is Posha Crunch. And they make healthy kid snacks. And the crisis that you're saying, when we currently don't have rice in the country as well, can we imagine? And so Posha Crunch initially made their products from wheat flour. And through a lot of the research and even access to a lot of their main inputs, they found an opportunity in heirloom rice flour varieties. And again, that's giving a benefit to not only the children that they serve and the nutritional value, but also to the farmers and their livelihoods. They're seeing this major push towards imported rice varieties when we have so many here that are incredibly nutritious, incredibly well adjusted to our terrain and our environment, so are environmentally sound, and giving that livelihood and opportunity for a buyer like Posha Crunch. And again, I think that back to your initial question on commercial sense, that ties into their value proposition. How are they able to diversify and create a niche where a lot of companies may overlook heirloom rice varieties as an option? And I think that also then covers a lot of the ESG requirements that they may have. But socially, they're able to really uplift communities, as well as look at what's the benefit to their end consumer, which again needs to be seen from end to end in order for us to really move forward and move beyond what we're currently working with.
Awesome. I'm going to direct this conversation in a totally different angle right now. Because Prashani, you brought up the reporting. There are so many standards, right? People get so confused with standards, reporting standards. So if you look at the principles, there are things like the UN SDGs, there are reporting standards such as TCFD, GRI, SBTI. I mean, how do companies really keep track of all of this? And we see in the Sri Lankan context, the Colombo Stock Exchange is now getting on board with these regulations and reporting standards. How do companies cope with all of it? How do you select which report you generate? How do you keep up with all of these changing dynamics?
It's referred to as an alphabet soup of frameworks, right?
Yeah.
And there's also a term called reporting fatigue, which is so real.
So real.
So I'm in reporting, so I know that. But I think we are kind of moving in the right direction. Because we had all these reporting frameworks starting from GRI to all those names that you mentioned, right? And they each had a different focus. But with the new IFRS S1 and S2 being introduced in June 2023, so what the regulators are trying to do is create a globally consistent platform for sustainability reporting. And it will be the first time, particularly in Sri Lanka, where sustainability reporting will be mandatory, so that everyone is brought to the same level. So I mean, I'm sure Pyumi can elaborate on this more. But for now, companies are just kind of starting to read up on the standard and, prepare for the implementation of S1 and S2. But to answer your question as to how do we navigate this complexity, so I think it really boils down to what is material, right? Figure out what is material to your company. Figure out what the information needs are for your stakeholders. Unfortunately, and I may get into trouble for saying this, in Sri Lanka, it's driven by the award competitions, right?
Oh, yes.
So, if you report on 5 frameworks, you get 5 times the mark, which adds a lot of pressure on companies. But I mean, in a way, I think it has supported the progress. And I think, you will agree with me, because if not for the awards, none of this could have happened, right? So you need to do your materiality analysis, figure out what your stakeholders are asking, and then pick the framework that is right for you, and then report on it properly. Don't just, pick one, do an index here, link somewhere, and just don't, right? So I think going forward, it's going to be a lot clearer. It will take time for Sri Lankan companies to adapt and learn. But I think we will all be in one platform when we start reporting on S1 and S2. Pyumi, you want to
No,
add?
absolutely. Materiality it is. And picking what is important to you, keep evaluating that, link it to risks, because then it becomes a more strategic thing. Use the reporting tools as a tool, like not as the one that drives you, which is the conversation that we keep trying to drive to companies. But it'll take a while, because we've been in this race to report and awards. And okay, great, we've been at the forefront. But I'll also bring in our famous survey, right? 2020, when we did the 56 country survey, we were right at the top. We were top 3 because the reporting was still great. Sri Lanka, I got a lot of glory out of it for Sri Lanka. And I was very proud Sri Lankan. Didn't last for too long. 2 years down the line, 2022, we plummeted all the way down to the 3rd quartile. Why? Because the metrics changed. The metrics were about accountability, Is the board's remuneration linked? Are you looking at the right risk factors? Climate risk, for example, right? Is that linked to your strategy? Okay. Or are we just, reporting yo-yo numbers year on year and making, spending more on paper? That's the kind of thing that differentiated us from the others. So a couple of years down the line, I think now we're redoing some of these surveys. I think we're gaining traction. What we need to be aware of is, compared to other countries, maybe we're not as fast, probably because investments need, we've got other issues that we've been dealing with. But I guess we can't ignore it. We need to use the tools, which is great. That's why it's great that the stock exchange is doing what they're doing. Having conversations with some of the funding agencies, whilst, yes, Sri Lanka has its own unique issues that they will look at, they are still very keen on ESG-linked investments as well. So there's like a lot more to gain from doing it right.
Okay. Listening to the two of you, this sounds exhausting, honestly. It feels like a massive team coming together, picking data from so many systems, people. Sometimes it might be on a little notebook where you run around and collect it from. Just sounds exhausting. And it seems like it's a lot of resources that you need, and not all companies have resources, right? Let's be honest. I mean, Emma, you can speak more on this. Like, of course, the larger organizations will put in a bit more money to recruit people to do the reporting. But how would SMEs or smaller scale organizations really keep up with all of this?
Sure. I think that's a really interesting question, because we're actually finding it to be the opposite. We're actually finding that for SMEs, especially the SMEs that we work with in these nature-based sectors, they're inherently and from their core doing a lot of these practices already. And so for them, when it comes to, again, fitting into monitoring using a framework, sure, yes, there is a bit of a resource constraint to execute, but when it comes to their business and their operations, they're quite sound because they've identified and are able to recognize that it's really got to come from within. It's really got to be their core business has to be in line with these standards. And there's really no other mode operandi. There's no other way for them to do it. And so it's actually been quite refreshing to see the SMEs being able to really be a shining light, an example. And of course, yes, they may have those resource constraints, but when it comes down to it, their operations really are what they say they are.
Emma, thank you so much for that, because the reason I asked that question was to really bring out that, because people get lost in this whole ESG thing. It's really about the fundamentals.
Yes.
We complicate it so much when it's not actually that complicated.
Right.
It has to be built into your system, into your business, and it's not really something you do outside of your business. It needs to be integrated into it. So in terms of complexity, do you think your organizations have kind of, made it a lot more complex? Can you keep it simple? Or the nature of your business is such that you really need to do what you guys do?
So I'll just kind of jump on again on what Emma was saying. And I really do agree with what you said, particularly in reporting, right? So since we just talked about reporting. So if you look at the S1 and S2 standards, Imali, what it requires at the end of the day is to quantify the impact of climate and other risks on your business. Quantify, right? So for example, quantifying the implications of rainfall. If you think of a company like Hayleys, and now this is something that we are losing sleep over. So like I said, 180 companies, and rainfall hits at so many different points, right? And so many different angles. And since we're now adopting the standard, we've started really looking at this in a really deeper way, right? So I'll just give you an example. Rainfall affects tea and rubber cultivation. We have plantation, so it hits there. It affects our supply chains because we rely on coconut fiber. So it hits that as well. It affects our power generation, right? We are 70% renewable energy. So rainfall affects your solar generation. It also affects your biomass, the quality of the biomass that you are sourcing. So many factors like this. So same with temperature. And to actually be able to quantify that requires an immense amount of resources. I mean, even for a large company, it's a big ask, right? But if you are an SME and if you are a smaller company, you probably have better control over those
Correct.
data points.
Yeah.
So I think, I always say this to my sectors, my companies. I'm like, rather than at the group level, the individual companies can do a better job.
Absolutely.
Because they have the processes in place. It's easier, when you are smaller, it's easier to do things. So that's how I feel this whole reporting landscape will evolve, right? But in terms of complexity, I mean, for Hayleys, it has been a journey. It hasn't been an easy one because the group is constantly evolving. There's like a couple of new businesses added every day. You go into new sectors like every year, right? So then there are new risks that come in. I think we are on a journey and we have progressed quite a bit, even in terms of how we report on our non-financial information. So now the same day that the financial information is tabled to the board, I have to table the non-financial metrics to the board, right? So energy, emissions, water, all that is collated across the group and consolidated at PLC level, and it's presented to the board. So, I mean, there is now some focus where you got directors actually sitting and asking, why is energy high? Why has the waste increased? So these are the conversations that you need to keep having. So yes, it is complex, but I think for a group like us, it will invariably be complex, right? Because it's different cultures, different systems.
Absolutely.
Like extensive value chains. But I think each company needs to find their own way. There is no hard and fast, there's nothing's written in stone. You have to figure out what is right for your company. And then you have to have a couple of good people to really drive that, I feel.
Okay. In terms of somehow when we talk about ESG, everything kind of comes down to that whole E, everyone focuses on the E.
Yeah.
And I try so hard to move these conversations away from the E. So Emma, in terms of diversity, do you think Sri Lanka as a country is actually doing well in terms of diversity under the social pillar of ESG? Or is there anything you think we could do better as a country? Do you see, is diversity like a big part of your organizations at the moment? Is it something that you focus on specifically?
Yes, and we frame it more in terms of inclusivity.
Okay.
So how inclusive is your business rather than, and again, I think that's approach that's being talked about so often these days is putting in these parameters and fulfillments and quotas to be able to fulfill a certain requirement. And I think that's where that inclusivity part comes in. If it comes from within, from your core business to be inclusive, to really account for all the stakeholders that you work with beyond just your employees, but your partners, your consumers, then those become very easy. Those naturally kind of fall into place. Of course, intervention is needed. And that's why we have these frameworks and that's why we have these conversations. But from the work that we're seeing, when that notion is inherent to a company to be inclusive, to really understand communities that they work with, they're able to pass with flying colors. Again, because it comes from within, it comes from that core strategy. So that's something that we've observed through the companies we've been working with.
Absolutely. I think, Pyumi, next question I want to ask you as a partner at KPMG. We have this talk of we have to have at least 50% female representation at a board level or whatever it is, right? But why 50%? Why can't it be if there are people who are actually deserving? And I don't mean just because you have to have 50%, you put females there. I'm talking about people who are actually good at what they do. Does it have to be 50%? Why does it have to stop at 50%? I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, I'm going to answer this more from a personal perspective.
Absolutely, yeah.
Having had careers in various countries, I am very appreciative of our value system that I've experienced here locally in our partnership, because we have, I think, 5 or 6 now female partners, very strong voiced, very, I would say they make their presence felt, right? I think we count for more than 50% for sure in terms of a voice. And I think I've seen that throughout my career. Yes, I think I've been fortunate as well. Whereas having worked elsewhere and seen what's happened, glass ceilings can be real. Sometimes glass ceilings aren't as real sometimes in Asia. It depends again on the organization. If I were to fulfill a seat because I was part of a quota, would I be happy? Ladies, I'm going to ask all of you, right? Are we going to be happy?
Absolutely
No,
not.
I don't think any of us are sitting in our seats because we fulfilled a quota.
Yeah.
We sit in our seats because we're really good at what we do.
Yeah.
At least I'd like to think so, right? So I think that counts. I wouldn't want to be part of a quota. But I go back to my value system conversation, right? A lot of what Sri Lanka is driven by the women, to be honest, right? Looking at grassroots as well. But also there's this whole conversation around retaining systems, processes. Yes, we need to change all of that. So in terms of diversity, inclusivity, not just female, male, but otherwise, I think there is a value system change that we can bring in. Every country has room for improvement. I work with the global human rights community across the KPMG global sphere, and I can see that across, right? Where each one is, there's always room for improvement, and Sri Lanka definitely can. But is it really, really bad? I wouldn't say so. If not, we wouldn't have 4 very powerful, strong-minded, voiced women sitting around this table, right? Having this conversation.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so to answer your question, no, I don't want to be part of a quota.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay, guys, anything you want to say in the ESG space that we haven't spoken about yet, but you think is extremely important that we say out loud right now? Anything you can think of? Prashani, Emma, Pyumi?
Yeah, I think I might probably fall into trouble for saying this again, but boards really do need to listen. Yeah, listen to Pyumi when they talk to you.
And you.
But
And you.
yes, it's difficult to drive change without that leadership support, no matter what you do. And I think going forward, it's going to be really challenging just to, just the image is not what matters. It's what you are authentically as an organization. And I think for that to happen, that tone at the top really has to change. It has to really be part of the DNA. I know it's a cliche, but to drive ESG, that is really what is required. Yeah.
I'm so glad, again, that we're in agreement with this and that we're closing with this as well, because it really is the driving message. It's something that, of course, we have all intimately observed in the work that we've done, that it really is to go beyond what we are monitoring, but to really use that to drive decisions. And I think in a local context, Sri Lanka has the opportunity, and South Asia has the opportunity for ESG to be our core strategy, to really drive, and for it to come from us. Of course, regulations may come from wherever in the world, but we have an inherent knowledge and practice that we've done for years that comes from this region in the way that we've not only operated our businesses, but how we operate in our community and the interconnectedness of it. And there's so much of value in that. And it would be such a shame if we don't own and harness that collective power that we have, not only in Sri Lanka, but as a region. So I really think that this can be that beacon, that light, for us to really progress as a region, to be more than just ESG compliant, but to really push and to become what we will always pioneer, which is to be regenerative, to really look at how much more that we can give back than we're taking in our operations.
For me, completely agree with both those points. And I think the third one, and I think this is what's going to make the change, is working together, alliances. It's not a one-person journey, it's an us journey. Whether it is Sri Lanka or the region, we need to do it together. If not, we're not going to make much of an impact.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Guys, you all want to ask me that question? Because I have something to say. as well.
Definitely. Nari, what do you think is the closing remark?
I think this needs to start at home. You know, we all forget that it needs to start at home. It needs to be taught in schools. Kids need to get their hands dirty with all of this stuff. It needs to be a part of the curriculum. We talk about it at the corporate level, but I don't think we need to push it as much if we start at home and, you know, while we are growing up. That's it. Sorry, I just had to put it out there.
Of course.
All right. So thanks a lot, guys, for being here with us today. It was a very insightful conversation. And I hope you had a good time. And Pyumi, I'm so sorry for keeping you on that chair for so long. And have a great day, ladies. Thank you.